Thank you very much for that introduction, Ruth. And colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm going to be speaking with you about greening recovery efforts for people, planet, and prosperity. And my talk here is my own, but it also benefits from a working team on the UN, a cross-UN working team. So let's jump right in. The slides have three sections. The first is the color of hope. Why is it green? The second looks at a future possible. And the third is about navigating forward. It's about concrete steps that we can take today to make ourselves better positioned for the future. So why? Why the color of hope? First of all, this is a crisis unlike any other, as Kristalina Georgieva has said. We haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes. And certainly going back to the two world wars and the Great Depression was the last time we've seen any kind of similar disruption on this scale, whether it's in the number of economies in recession, which is the blue line, or whether it's the strength of the contraction, that's the red dot. And you see World War II there really standing out. But this is a hit that will define our generation moving forward. So why a green recovery? Well, the literature is quite strong on this point. The graphic here is from Hepburn et al., Stiglitz and Lord Stern as well. They produced some research in 2020 that looked at those areas of investment that have the strongest return, both in terms of growth and also in terms of climate impact, positive climate impact. And the literature basically coalesces around 5 areas that have the biggest bang for the buck or hit for the money. The first is on clean energy, so the energy transition, what this conference is all about. And this is also supported by data from a recent IMF working paper. The second is about investing in nature conservation, restorative agriculture, ecosystems restoration. These are investments in our basic life support system. The third area is buildings efficiency. Buildings are huge consumers of energy, of materials. Increasing buildings efficiency can position us for the future and create many jobs. Green transportation, public transportation, non-motorized transport, very job rich, and it positions us for the future that we need. It reduces the pressure on climate, on nature, and on pollution. And the fifth category is green R&D spending. It's about innovation, it's about learning, it's about doing things better. So those are 5 areas that the literature points to as being the very basis of a green recovery. When we look at spending over the past year, basically since the pandemic hit and the lockdown, it's a colossal sum of money and equally unprecedented to the hit. We've never seen this kind of a fiscal response. Almost 15 trillion in 2020 alone of announced spending. This excludes the Biden package, which was recently approved just a few weeks ago in the US. And most of that spending, most of that 15 trillion was on rescue. It was simply keeping firms and families afloat. It was first line defense, health, and basically protection. When it comes to recovery spending, much less, around $2 trillion. And of that recovery spending, even less was green in those 5 areas that I spoke to earlier. With our colleagues at Oxford, we documented who's spending on what. This data set, by the way, is publicly available at the web link below, and I encourage you to have a look. It's very data rich. Over 3,500 fiscal policies were clocked. And if you look at over time, the amount of green spending, it did grow over the year, but it's concentrated in a handful of countries. And here some interesting standouts include South Korea, China, and also Japan from the Asia-Pacific rim. When we look at this data, and we look at the top 50 economies in the world, we can see who's spending what on what part of the green recovery. So on that y-axis, on the vertical axis, you have the percentage of the green spending. And there's countries that we classified as having early promise because much of their recovery spending was green, but it wasn't that much spending. And then on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, you have the percent of recovery spending as a percentage of GDP. And you can see there's some countries that have spent a lot on recovery in terms of GDP, but the ones who spent both green and large are up in the right-hand corner. And those are the current leaders in terms of the green recovery. Now, as part of bringing this recovery spending forward, there is a corollary, of course, and that is debt. We're bringing money into the present from the future. And so we've seen a huge spike in debt. And some countries, frankly, can't do this. They don't have the fiscal space. They don't have the monetary sovereignty to bring that money forward. And so we see in advanced economies 17 times higher spending per capita than in emerging and developing countries. This will simply increase inequalities across the globe. It results in what we've called a K recovery, where you actually see divergent paths. We need to bear this in mind as we go forward, because some countries don't have the luxury of printing more money or creating more fiscal space. So pivoting towards the future, what could it look like? We have a plan. We have a vision of prosperity, and it's called the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the 2030 Agenda, what Secretary Guterres has called our best and only plan, adopted by all the countries in the world. And Goal 13 is about climate action, which was reinforced by the Paris Agreement. These are our navigational tools for the future. Every recovery effort needs to align with the 2030 Agenda, or we're not moving forward. And there's a very concrete way of looking at this. This graph on the left here looks at footprints, and it just takes a handful of countries randomly, more or less. You can see in a country that has a high footprint, around 10 metric tons per capita of CO2 equivalent, the lion's share of this is in food, housing, and mobility. They're all energy intensive sectors. And when you get down to the countries with a lower footprint, like India or Brazil, 2.8 or 2.0 metric tons per capita on average, respectively, you see that those footprints are much lower, they're much more compressed. And in general, to reach the climate targets by 2030, by 2040, by 2050, you see the bar, the threshold lowering. So the scale of innovation and change that's needed to bring our per capita footprints down is simply colossal. And what it means is we need all hands on deck. Now, there are some very good examples from countries around the world that are using the recovery opportunity to reposition themselves for that future. In green energy, we've seen standout efforts from Argentina, from Colombia, from Vietnam, with an array of policy tools and investments. Same for green transport in India, in Mexico, in Peru, non-motorized transport, public transport, reducing the carbon footprint of mobility. The same for green buildings. In Brazil and Colombia, major efforts to reduce the footprint of buildings. And a lot of it has to do with the carbon footprint of buildings, but also the resource footprint. And in natural capital, ecosystems restoration and restorative agriculture, we've seen big efforts in countries such as Spain, China, and India. In fact, China and India and the emerging and developing countries spent more on natural capital and ecosystems restoration as part of the recovery packages than the advanced economies, which I found very interesting. So a few last slides as we look towards navigating forward. The Secretary General has laid out 6 climate positive actions. He laid these out in early 2020 after the pandemic hit, and thoughts were turning to, how do we move? Well, the first are very clear. It's all about jobs. It's all about the transition. But the second is do no harm. Don't bail out your polluting industries. End fossil fuel subsidies. Those investments, those public finance investments that are moving in the wrong direction. Take climate into account in all decisions, working together, and leave no one behind. And more broadly, as part of this cross-UN working group on green recoveries, which I mentioned earlier, we came up with 3 baskets: investing in nature and planet, ecosystems restoration. It's the decade of ecosystems restoration, and agriculture has one of the largest job and carbon and water and biodiversity footprints in the entire economy. Total spending, 56 billion so far. Peanuts. Fossil fuel subsidies every year are around 350 billion. Investing in prosperity. This is the larger part of where the money needs to flow because it's infrastructure. It's energy infrastructure, it's buildings infrastructure, and it's mobilities infrastructure. It's also resource efficiency and investments in circularity, reducing the material footprint of how we make and consume products. And thirdly, it's about investing in people. It's about social protection. It's about education to bridge the digital divide. It's about R&D. It's about connectivity and the fiscal reforms needed to shift money flowing into those parts of education, health, and the environment. Here, less spending, 28.9 billion in terms of the green recovery. And then the fourth basket is really how you get it done. It's about where the financing comes from. It's about greening budgets because every dollar, every euro needs to count. It's about green finance roadmaps and new instruments like green and blue bonds, and also debt for climate swaps. This is a new area that colleagues such as the IMF and the World Bank are looking at and even approved at the spring meetings about 2 weeks ago. There'll be a new instrument out by the end of the year, we're told. So, colleagues, these are just some ways forward. At the UN, we have some navigational tools for prosperity. The first is the Recovery Observatory, which I mentioned earlier, which is data-rich and open access to everyone. The Hotspots Analysis Tool, with time series data on 180 countries over 25 years, looking at the footprint, the carbon, water, toxicity, pollution footprint of every country in the world, of every economic sector in each country. Hotspots analysis tool, green jobs assessment, and other tools of metrics like inclusive wealth, which go beyond GDP metrics. So here I wrap it up, and thanks very much, Ruth, and back over to you.